Hello. Do we have people in here?
Not yet. No, I think the stream is 4 noon, but we wanted to give them a little bit of time
to
join. But this will be captured in the actual video that saves. So
cool. Wow.
Looks like there's 8
hey
people
guys.
now.
8?
Yeah.
Good. That's 8 more than I expected.
Well, I was optimistic. I expected 800. Yeah.
Did I show you my mug?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Is that a custom mug?
Yeah. They give this to you. They give this to you if you purchased over $400,000 US in Air Monarchs.
Yeah.
In your lifetime. So it's
Did you you bury all of them in your backyard?
Well, each one of them has a soul. So I wear them once it's expired, then I bury them in the yard. It's the only way to really truly send off a pair of Air Monarchs is to put it in the Air Monarch cemetery. That's actually Stephen King's Pet Cemetery was based on that, but he thought it wouldn't be relatable because a lot of people don't have the gumption to wear an Air Monarch.
Yeah.
You know, it takes some real oomph to actually commit to that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
All right, it's noon. You want to get rolling?
Let's do it. Let's get started. Cool. Yeah. So I'll just introduce us. Welcome to the Coachlogik mentorship program. I'm excited to be part of this. I'm excited for this thing to happen. Yeah, I'll just introduce ourselves, and then maybe Josh, you want to kind of explain what this is all about. But
sure.
I'm Max Ada. Obviously, you know, people know me from places like the internet and weightlifting and powerlifting. I've been coaching for decades now. I've basically been involved in strength sports or something with a barbell for my entire life, I think, at this point. And yeah, I'm super excited to try to bring and share my expertise, my practical experience. I met Josh, unfortunately, maybe a few years ago, probably like 2019 was the first time I met you. But yeah, Josh kind of opened my eyes a bit more as far as like, you know, the application of sports science into you know, training and coaching. And so I got a lot more interested in that, and, you know, working with Josh over these last few years has been something that's made me really passionate about this idea of like bringing real concrete kind of research and sports science into the coaching world. So that's where I'm at. Yeah, and that's who I am. Josh, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I would love to. So for people who aren't familiar, don't know me, my name is Joshua Gibson. I am a person who's absolutely obsessed with weightlifting and powerlifting, strength sports, and sports science. It's some weird affinity for training theory and practice. And that largely has driven kind of every decision I've made for the last 10 plus years. It's all been training related. It's all been dedicated to the pursuit of performance within specific contexts. And that's manifested itself as, you know, reading hundreds of thousands of hours of research, books, podcasts, conversations, driving to go to places where experts are, bringing them where I am, and trying to find this like intersection of, well, I know that I want to know everything. I know that I want to better understand or best understand this like profession. And then also, like, I think a lot of other people want to, as how can we provide that to them? It's never really been about like clout or notoriety. I mean, a lot of the stuff I've done has been not the best quality from like an appearance or aesthetic perspective, but I think what underpins all of it is really the most up-to-date evidence-informed information possible. And again, that's manifested itself in the form of the leading educational podcast in weightlifting, hundreds and hundreds of episodes, countless articles, seminars, presentations, talks, and then also coaching people to a national level in weightlifting, powerlifting, and then getting a PhD in basically applied sports science. And a lot of my dissertation and my research really is going to be assessing strength and power characteristics of high school athletes using force plates and using jump testing. So I'd like to think that I'm trying to immerse myself in this as much as possible so that when I give it back, it's been filtered as strongly as it needs to be to say like, hey, I believe this is the case. I believe this is the best information that's going to change your coaching practice. So I think that's where we both come from.
Yeah, that's awesome. So that's kind of who we are. I think what we kind of want to do here is talk about, let's just introduce what is Coachlogik, what is all of this stuff we're doing, and then kind of why we're doing it. You know, what's the point here? But for me, so Coachlogik is the name of our new coaching platform, and is essentially the sort of new platform for a slew of new products and things that are going to exist, which are coaching platform, meaning a place for coaches to administer training, monitor training, give feedback, do actual online coaching or remote coaching or in person. And then it's the technology platform that will allow us to integrate research, sports science, new information directly into tools that coaches can use. And then that also trickles down to athletes as well. So, the purpose of Coachlogik, or the mentorship program, is to basically build out the other arm of this process. There's a ton of products out there. There's a ton of, coaching resource and knowledge. There's a lot of just sort of information floating in the ether. And the problem I had as a young coach and as a young athlete is that there's a ton of Russian manuals or a ton of books, and you could read all of them, but none of them really do a good job of saying hey, here's information and research and science. How can you take that, extract what's valuable from it, extract what's useful from it, and then deliver that into a process or a method, or implement it into the actual practical side of training and coaching. It's easy to read a periodization book and then be even more confused and feel like, what do I do now? What's the next thing to do? And rather than spend decades sort of fumbling around and figuring it out, I believe, and Josh does as well, that the mentorship side of this is what's critical, right? So we need a vehicle to do the actual, stuff. And it doesn't have to be, using Coachlogik, obviously. You can do anything you want, right? But there needs to be a vehicle whereby we can actually execute on new knowledge and new information. We need to take new knowledge and new information and then basically educate ourselves and learn from that information, then apply it. And so that's kind of the concept here with Coachlogik, is we want to bridge that gap so that things Josh learns, or things that you might learn in the sports science setting, can be distilled down, discussed, extract information that's useful, discard stuff that's not, and then turn that into an actual executable process. And that's our goal here with the mentorship program, is to do that, is to take our experience, our learning, Josh's information, other sports science, other guests, those things, get it into a place where people can understand it. We can all decide and talk and discuss what's useful, what's not, then act on it and make ourselves better coaches. So yeah, that for me is what kind of sums up, what this is and why we're doing it, right? We want a mentorship program because and I think Josh would agree with this, is we see a huge lack of this. There's just nothing. There's a lot of sort of informational stuff that kind of is just out there as here's a book I wrote, my system. People might adopt that system and use it, but that's not really learning. It's more just copying, right? It's mimicking. It's saying, hey, here's the 5x5 program. I just do that, and now I'm a 5x5 guy. We don't want that. We want people to understand what the actual underlying stuff is that makes that program effective, so that they can build a program for themselves. They can build something different. They can understand, the fundamentals and educate themselves and, do better work with it.
Well, and I think to that point, the purpose and the mission statement's in the name, right? Coachlogik. Logic is a mode or system of reasoning. It's defined as that. And I think when we take a step back and we think about science, right? People reference science all the time, and sometimes I would kind of ask, like, why do people distrust science? And you know, they give these reasons of like, well, here are all these bad things that have happened. It's like science is a process of reasoning. It's a process of testing the natural world to see if there are relationships, and to find relationships, and to potentially create changes within the natural world. I mean, that's truly what it is. And all these analyses allow us to do that and try to get closer to finding the truth of what's the relationship, what's the cause and effect relationship. Coaching, it's kind of in this state, especially in weightlifting, where it's, you know, it's like, well, what is weightlifting coaching? And like you said, people say these like definable programs, like that's, you know, it's 5x5 or it's West Side or it's this given like recipe of constructing training programs, but that's not really what it is. What it should be is a process of finding the best information, the highest quality information, getting you closest to the approximate or the appropriate cause and effect relationship that's going to improve coaching practice. So if I want to get someone to build size, build muscle size or strength or capacity or whatever it is, technique, it's like, how do I know I'm getting closest to that true cause and effect relationship? That's taking the best science, right? The best process of asking that question and answering it, and then applying it in a coaching context or a weightlifting context. That's really what we're attempting to do. And I think where it generally falls short, or where we've fallen short, is by relying on people who aren't experts to answer that question for us, and use faulty tools to get us there, which is experience, anecdote, best guess, intuition, and those have a place, but they have a place paired with objectivity and reasoning and logic, which is kind of embedded in the name, which is embedded in what we're ultimately going to deliver.
Yep. So let's kind of just introduce kind of what the format's going to be here as far as the actual mentorship group. And then kind of give an overview of how that's going to go, and then we can actually dive into our topic for today. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, I mean, the mentorship group, like we've kind of talked about, is essentially that. It's the vehicle by which we can take sports scientists, experts, researchers, new information, you know, expert coaches, and basically mentor people who lack that knowledge or have no exposure to it, or are lost in the sense that they don't have a good barometer as to like, who should I listen to? What's good information, right? This mentorship program is going to be designed around the idea that we're pulling people in, elevating coaching, elevating people's, you know, understanding of training principles and everything, and then kind of guiding people along. I think we both agree that the way to learn, at least in this sense, in this context, is through a much more open format. You know, versus bringing people into a classroom setting and saying, hey, there's 12 weeks of lessons and you're going to go through lesson 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then you're good to go. Or doing a seminar where over the course of, you know, 16 hours, you learn the, you know, just barely how to do, you know, whatever, the technique of a snatch or clean and jerk, or, you know, some basic rudimentary training principles. We want to do something that's sort of nonlinear, in that, like, we don't have this dedicated lesson plan of learn this, then do that. We want to basically pull people in, immerse them in this stuff, bring in guests, bring in stuff. And the goal for me as well with this is that we want it to be as quick of a process as possible. So we want to go from learning something to being able to execute on that as soon as you can, because that's the thing that's going to actually drive and elevate coaching, is that you can take this advice or take this information and make it actionable. So the structure is a bit different because of that. So we're going to have basically the first Friday of every month will be this kind of call, the first free Friday. So it's going to be an open to the public discussion. Basically, it's either going to be Josh and I talking, a guest, you know, could be a myriad of different things, but it's going to give people, you know, you guys, an example of what this is like, you know, how we interact, how it's a little bit more of a sort of casual style in some senses, but also like you'll get a taste of what this is like. So that Friday, that first one every month, is free. Then we're going to do like following calls inside the mentor group, right? We're going to have guests. So we'll probably have at least once a month, some kind of a guest that discusses, you know, their topic. So Josh has a huge network of people who have been on his podcast, you know, everyone from like, weightlifting historians to, basically like the most cutting edge sort of sports science researchers. So we'll always bring in people that are, I think, interesting and applicable, people that are going to bring in stuff that's very useful to you as coaches. And then we're going to have, some kind of reading and content as well that you guys will have. So weekly we'll be delivering either through email or maybe other medias, but essentially like reading material, research reviews, articles, blogs, these kind of things. And then, a sort of practical side of that, sort of like getting user interaction through live Q&As or, quizzes or tests or these kind of things, whatever format we find, that can be best. We don't necessarily have to be perfect. We just have to be, continuing to adapt this process to fit people. So yeah, I don't know if I missed anything there, Josh, but that's basically the process.
Well, I think the problem, Max, is that because you're in your own little weightlifting bubble, and because I've been in that bubble with you, like you undersell everything a lot because one, like having us to discuss weightlifting, like the conversations we've had have been the only place where I feel like we've broken ground on novel concepts in the sport of weightlifting. And the people I often reference, Zach Robinson, Jake Rimmer, the data-driven strength guys, Milo Wolf, the researchers who are at the edge of what we know, and they're asking questions about, hey, what don't we know about hypertrophy and individual response? Let's ask a question, create a study design, and implement it, right? They're actually testing protocols to gauge like which would be better or statistically which is more significant. The conversations we have are the only ones where I've felt like I've learned something new about weightlifting, and the same things haven't been rehashed over and over and over again. So like when you say it's like a casual discussion or a conversation, it's like way more than that. It's just we get used to having hours and hours and hours on end about these topics. So I think being able to bring that to the public in an organized way is really important. And you kind of mentioned, the free Friday call is also casual. I've read the articles referenced writing the outline. I've read a handful of times. I didn't read them again, but I read one by Bird, 2005, and it's like pretty deep content. It's like breaking down training variables in a way that's like not talked about in the weightlifting space. So I think what could feel casual when we're on, right, when you and I are on and we're doing really well and we're preparing, we're executing, like I think it's going to be unmatched. And I think that's because of the fact that we don't limit it again to weightlifting content. We don't reference Greg Everett's book. Shout out to Greg. We don't reference the Russian manuals like as the sole source of training, the training Bible. We don't reference super training. We don't, everything that people will think of when they think about coaching knowledge or information, we don't reference that because that stuff is outdated. It's outdated in the sense that it's not adapting and changing with time, which is what the science does, the literature does, is it builds on itself. Textbooks and books that are written kind of as a one-off don't do that, and they don't capture the landscape. So what we're going to do is bring the most up-to-date information, the most comprehensive and complete applicable information to the sport of weightlifting, powerlifting, and strength and conditioning, sports science. And it can become a long list of like where it's applicable, but the reality is it's mostly weightlifting and powerlifting, and then we also have experience in strength and conditioning, sport performance, sports science. So I don't want to undersell it, because what's going to happen will be courses with PhDs, and will be extensive conversations with people who are studying, again, individual response to hypertrophy style training or autoregulation or fatigue management. It's like, these are the people you need to look at when you're thinking about like, how is the landscape or the literature changing with time? And just to comment one last thing, the doctorate level classes I'm in, it's more of a Socratic dialogue than it is a lecture-based, class. So I think this is true to one of the best ways to learn about it, which is a conversation that bridges theory and practice. It has people who are interested and willing to know more and want to know more. And then it kind of opens everyone up to having some sort of equal footing. Not that they're going to create content, but like you can contribute to the content that's brought in and disseminated.
Yeah. Yeah. And, again, to reiterate what Josh is saying, this is all about, my philosophy has changed a lot as far as how things, how things evolve, right? To spend a year developing a very specific course with certain lesson plans and blah, 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 and having this thing and a template, and then you get super invested in that, and then you just sell your template and you sell your little program, your university style, like here it is. I don't believe that's the best way to do things, because you've invested something into it. You have no sense to change. We want to iterate and be adapting this. So that's why I believe like Josh said, the Socratic method, I guess we could call it, instead of the casual method. The informal method is to say, what is the information people actually need and they're going to benefit from? We adapt the process to that, right? We want to drive an adaptable system here that gets education out there, versus just saying, hey, we'd spent a bunch of time building this cool course, buy it, and in 6 years it's the same course, nothing's changed.
Yeah.
That's not the plan. So yeah, I guess let's maybe we should get into it. You want to kick off the first topic here, first Free Friday?
Yeah. So the last thing I'll say, we kind of mentioned who will be involved, which are experts who span every part of the profession that we're in and every aspect of it. Because the questions can get granular and they can be really broad. So I think having the right experts for each question is very important. How people who are listening can be involved is by asking great questions, right? It's like, if you have a thought or an idea or a question or a concern, put it out there, right? We're going to have people who are involved who are Olympic level coaches all the way down to grassroots, boots on the ground, club level coaches who are just kind of like, I want to know everything I can about weightlifting. If you ask questions, you contribute or participate in polls, you request experts, again, I think you're maximizing your involvement, and then you're also contributing to the development of other coaches. This week, we're going to talk about training variables. So what made sense to me, and I think what makes sense if you think about it, which is starting broadly and becoming more specific across time, just like a great program. This is going to set the scene or set some of the framework for the weeks to come and the months to come, because we're going to have Chris Tabor on for our expert this month, which is next week. And us three will discuss training variables more specifically and more deeply and kind of dig into that. And then we'll eventually branch out and have people on who are experts in hypertrophy training, which is volume management or the quantification of volume and the application of it. People who are the same with intensity or load or maximal strength. And then you'll see how that'll kind of shape out across time. So we're going to talk about training variables today, which has to start broadly as understanding training in and of itself as a process. And there's been a lot of back and forth and a lot of poo-pooing at times on periodization, but it's just a misunderstanding. Periodization really is describing specific periods of time, and this has been used in different realms beyond sport or performance. It's also been used in art and history. So if you think of it broadly as the description of periods of time, and then we think about it in a sport context, which could be breaking blocks of time into, and this is a quote from a paper by Kunanen et al., and that's a paper on general adaptation syndrome, which I can send if anyone's interested. But it's basically breaking blocks of time into definable and manageable components for enhanced organization and pattern recognition within the training process. So when we think about good coaching, we say it all the time, it's thinking in patterns and not pieces. A lot of the processes that are going to be put in place are basically to pick up on patterns, right? I think a lot of us have access to similar information about training and the way we can apply it, like the way we can write programs. What's going to really differentiate great coaches from good coaches or expert coaches would be this ability to have a system that's solidified, that iterates, but that picks up on patterns and knows how to be adaptable or change according to those patterns. So periodization is breaking up blocks into definable, manageable components to pick up on patterns within the training process. A little more specifically, time is allocated towards various fitness phases that are strategically aligned in a unilateral fashion. So a forward-facing fashion toward competition. Conceptually, periodization is a blueprint that permits the coach to forecast and assign periods of time toward the acquisition and realization of specific fitness characteristics, which would be endurance, strength, power, speed. What periodization isn't It's not programming, and programming is not periodization. Those are very distinct. And if you think about programming as like, oh yeah, I periodize my training, it's like, well, that you would write programs. You're not writing periodization, because the critical difference is that planning component, or that breaking up a training period into definable, manageable blocks of time to maximize, or to have different levels of focus on different adaptations. Obviously, a lot more there, and we're going to dig into it. But Max, you want to jump in?
No, I think from the coach's perspective, right? I see it like this. You know, periodization is essentially the conceptual model of structuring planning, of planning in a structured way to achieve multiple different, outcomes, such that at the end of the program you have something where it is the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Right. If we need to achieve 3 or 4 different types of adaptations that compound on each other, that ultimately end in a superior outcome at the end of the process, then we have to structure things in logical ways. If there was no need to do that, you would just train, you just go to maximum every day. So I see it like that from a coach's perspective. The most sort of basic thing here is that it's conceptual. What are we doing that allows us the best possible way to sequence and structure and organize things, so we're not, stepping over ourselves or wasting time, or, regressing because we're just doing things in the wrong way or the wrong order. And ultimately we want our programs to be effective. And to do that, we want to try to capitalize on every possible avenue we can, right? So when we think about these things, we have to think about there's no right or wrong answers, there's just trade-offs. But what are the trade-offs that we make, in our overall plan here? And periodization is essentially an attempt to solve that problem.
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing we have to remember is that competition, caveat, nuance, whatever, competition dates don't change. If you have American Open finals and the date is set, you have to be peaked on that day. I mean, there's really no arguing that. So the idea is that, like, okay, with the allocated time, with 4 months or 5 months or 6 months, what's my system for getting us to a peak on a given day? Baked in that, there are a lot of assumptions. There are a lot of assumptions, and that's where you put the coaching and scientist hat on, and you say that I know that theory will tell us this. I know that theory tells us that bigger muscles are generally stronger muscles. So we should have dedicated time to changing the size of someone's quads and shoulders and the muscles involved in snatching and clean and jerking, or squatting or pulling. And if you think about it from that way, you would think, okay, what are the best strategies for building size or building muscle? And how can we have blocks emphasized toward that? Okay, if we did that effectively, how is that going to bleed into the next block, which bleeds into the next block? So there's this logical sequencing that's built on theory. And again, that word logic comes up, right? It's reasoned. It's a reasoned approach to tackling the performance problem. And you have logical sequencing. You take all your theory, you apply it over time, and you need to peak on a given day, and you test that peak, and you say, okay, what worked, what didn't, why? And then you iterate on that for the next competition block, which is a definable amount of time. It's knowable, and you can start to kind of build in the programming component, which lives and dies by that period of planning. Again, the limitations are that you are applying theory across time, which you kind of have to take a step back and trust that, yeah, if we do higher volumes of training, it can contribute to building size, even if we don't have direct measurements. Strategic variation is going to help with a lot of different variables like fatigue management, skill acquisition, even if they aren't directly observable in the immediate moment, right? So you have to be able to have that like impulse control of the easiest way to do it is to go to maximum. The hardest way to do it is to strategically build yourself an ability to maximize your ability to go to maximum. Right. So we're actually trying to hit new levels of performance. We're not just trying to test our performance all the time. So you have to have the scientific approach to it, but you also have to have like baked in strategies of saying readiness is an acute factor of performance. Preparedness is a chronic factor. And we need to be able to also understand like how ready are we, how able to perform are we, can we build in strategies to accommodate that too. So on the individual, like smallest unit of time, can we accommodate performance? And then on the largest unit of time, can we accommodate changes in performance? So it's complex, which is why coaching is hard, and it's a profession, and we wanted to arm people with the ability to do that better.
Yeah, exactly. Should we get into a bit of the actual training variables? Kind of what we think. I mean, not what we think. What we know are the training variables. I think from the perspective of, if you look at when someone starts coaching, in my experience, I started a lot with this idea of like, oh, I know certain things, like, let's rewind to early Max, when he's, just a young Bulgarian boy dreaming of the big stage. And you're thinking, okay, training is just a combination of sets and reps. And there's like, maybe you have this thought that like there's a magical combination of sets and reps that has some profound impact. Or maybe you think that like certain things are evil, like anything more than one rep is the end of the world and that'll ruin your training. There's a lot of sort of like lack of understanding of the fundamentals, the first principles of training, that just ends up becoming like I won't say a cancer, but it becomes like these biases that exist in people's thought process about training variables, to where it's not looked at as, this outcome or this training variable manipulated in this way will have this type of effect, or the probability of it having this effect is higher. We have learned a lot, and as I grew up, as I got into training more and understanding the principles of training more, I started to understand the reality is that first of all, there's nothing super definitive. There are definitely things that are more or less probabilistically true. Doing sets of 5 will build strength, right? And maybe you could peak for a meet doing sets of 5. That's possible. There's plenty of people that have probably done that. So, it's not to say that like, okay, you have to do sets of 1 to peak, right? Or that, you could build, muscle mass, you could build hypertrophy doing lower rep sets. It's been proven now. So it's not the like original sort of like, 25 years ago, which is like, oh, sets of 3 to 6 are strength, sets of 8 to 10 are hypertrophy, and sets of 1, right? Like there's a bit more nuance there, and there's a bit more from the training perspective, more fundamentally than those, is understanding the underlying principles, so that you can then take the variables of training and make them work for you in the way you want them to. I think we've talked, anyone who's spoken to, I know me, has probably listened or heard of the scientific principles of training. We can kind of quickly cover these, but there's a ton of research about this. There's a ton of information about this online, and we'll probably share some of this kind of stuff, through newsletters and blog posts and whatnot. So, again, if people have more questions on any one thing we've asked or spoken about, then, just drop it in there and we'll reference it later at the end of this. But, the scientific principles are basically specificity, overload, fatigue management, variation, phase potentiation, SRA, and individual differences. And these are all basically the governing processes, governing principles behind program design, periodization, everything. Our training variables, sets, reps, intensities, internal metrics of stress. These are the things that we actually play with as coaches, right? These are the things we write on a piece of paper or we type into a system and end up spitting out a program. It's a collection of these things, but they have to start somewhere. We have to draw our information from somewhere, and that's always going to be from the principles. We want a principle-based approach to everything, because that gives us the ability to, translate this from a weightlifting program to powerlifting to, to running, to whatever. We understand the principles, we'll understand the entire system and the program way better, right? So, Josh, what are the training variables?
Yeah, so the training variables kind of underpin the expression of those principles, and kind of a few points you made. You made a lot of great points, because you mentioned when you started out coaching, you had an idea of like, oh, here's like sets and reps and the application within a workout. Anyone can get someone results, especially for novice or beginner athletes. Like, general training yields general results. You can go cycle on a bike and get stronger. You can run and get stronger. You can think about training and get stronger. Or according to Dr. Hornsey, my chair, you can hit someone with a stick and they'll get stronger. And that's probably true.
That's a safe sport violation now, by the way. So,
well, jokes on me. I need to actually redo my safe sport certification. But the training principles and the application of them really start to matter as someone gets better and better and better. You have to have more precision in the application of the training to make them better, right? To maximize performance. And a good stat, actually, when we talk about measurement, is sometimes in competition, say first through fourth place can be decided by like 1.5% difference in performance. And Inigo Mujica, an expert on tapering and peaking, he's talked about like the difference between first through eighth and some like major swimming competition was like such a small amount of time that you think, yeah, there is a big difference on how I taper someone. There is a big difference on how I peak. There is a big difference on how I program, not just like, well, we PR'd. It's like, well, the point's not to PR, the point's to win. So if you leave kilos or centimeters or seconds on the table, I mean, you're really compromising the quality of your coaching, and you're compromising their performance, because you don't feel like you need to be well-rounded and to be adaptable and to really have a good grasp on training theory and practice. So we start with training variables, the principles, and then everything underneath, so you can better grasp like, how do I manipulate them to maximize performance? Because it's not just about doing a good enough job, it's doing the best job that you can. The training variables that we're going to discuss today really are load, volume, and exercise selection. Those are the bedrock of training, and those break down a lot, right? So when I say load, volume, and exercise selection, you're like, oh, I know what load is. I know what volume is. I know what exercise selection is. Like, yeah, you do hang snatches in block 1, you do other hang snatches in block 2, and then you go to classics for block 3. Again, that lacks a lot of nuance. It lacks the ability to be applied in novel ways across time with athletes who respond individually to training. Some people experience a 150% increase in muscle size to an intervention. Some people see a loss in muscle, right, for whatever reason. So understanding these so you can program to the individual is the most important thing. So when we break down to load, in the literature, this will be often used as load, but we can think of it as the amount of weight assigned to an exercise set. And it could potentially be the most important variable in resistance training because strength is specific, and the tests are measures of absolute strength or explosive strength. So it's a 1 repetition test, testing force production maximally, or the maximal force production across a specific period of time. And that's from an article actually we can send out if people are interested. It's by Bird, it's 2005, and it talks all about training variables. Data indicate that in the short to moderate term, load is largely responsible for driving strength adaptations. But in the long term, having a focus on volume can enhance future training outcomes. So the minimum effective dose research will tell us you can do 1 repetition of a deadlift once a week and see meaningful improvements in strength. But like practically from a coaching perspective, knowing that hypertrophy, effective hypertrophy training will ultimately drive future performance or performance potential will tell us that like loads should be de-emphasized at times to emphasize accumulating work or the correct amount of work or type of work. So while load is critical in the short to moderate term, volume is critical in the moderate to long term to be able to actually maximize our potential as an athlete or as athletes. So volume here, so load, yeah, think of it as like percent of 1 RM also, or intensity. Intensity is tough because it can be perception of effort. So load just is a way to delineate that. Volume, on the other hand, is the total amount of work done, measured in myriad ways, and is largely responsible for adaptation related to hypertrophy, work capacity, endurance, and other improvements that are chalked up to work across time. So we think of volume less so in the very specific context of a session and more so in the context of sessions. Intensities or load is often thought of in like a single session, right? I'm going to do a 1 RM test, or I'm going to do heavy singles or heavy triples. And that's like, I'm going to drive strength across this session. Volume's tough because it can be calculated in many ways. Some are more or less accurate. But the most important thing with that, in weightlifting, it's generally repetitions, right? I think in powerlifting and other sporting contexts, it'll be sets. There's volume load, which is sets times reps times weight, and then you factor in displacement. So there are a bunch of ways to do it. The big thing here is when you think about volume, have a system of measuring volume and then stick with that across time. And then you can learn the intricacies or the patterns involved with tracking volume, which could be, if I use reps, there are certain trade-offs, and instead of trying to patch up the blind spots that are with tracking reps, you just say, well, I know those, I acknowledge those, and my system looks like this across 3 years, so I can kind of accommodate the trade-offs versus having volume load and then reps and then set number and then maybe even delineating hard sets. Like, it just adds a lot of messiness to it, which can be a simple process if you have an ability to recognize or pick up on patterns. Max, do you want to jump in before you exercise?
So I do want to sort of point out some things here, is that, if we just speak to the training variables from the concept of basically the measurable and assignable things we can write down, right? It's, if we say sets and reps, the summation of those equals, volume or training, the entirety of the training program. The training variables are something that is probably the most complex part of things, but at the same time can be oversimplified in a lot of ways, right? So it's very easy to look at and say, okay, I hear these guys talking about training volume. It's like you count the number of reps. Well, are all reps equal, right? Well, what about 1 rep at 80% and 1 rep at 90%? And okay, well, then I can multiply them together and get tonnage. And then tonnage is a way of calculating. It's like, understand these training variables it can quickly scale to this thing that feels overwhelming, right? The sort of question, and I asked this question to Josh many times, we talk about these kind of things like, why would you do 3 reps versus 2 reps at a certain weight? Right? Why would you do, what is this or that? What is the what is the benefit of, this? Is a rep at this intensity worthwhile? How many reps in a week should we be doing? All these things that seem like they can easily become this kind of overwhelming hodgepodge of little tiny isms and okay, well, don't do triples because I saw a guy on the internet say that triples are cardio and that's not weightlifting, or, don't do this or that. What Josh is kind of talking about here is a system of the training variables are what we know we can prescribe somebody, right? I can assign an intensity and say, hey, put this much weight on the bar and try to lift it this many times, right? That's the actual bridge between a coach and an athlete. The way that I calculate that, the way that I do that doesn't have to be the same way that everybody else does, right? Years ago in weightlifting, in a lot of the old weightlifting research that exists in the Soviet Union, which is not bad research at all, there's sort of a uniform approach to this process, which was to calculate total reps, right? And then try to granularize the understanding of that. So instead of saying, oh, we're doing 200 reps of snatch, 200 reps of Olympic lifts in a week, you then have to sort of get more information. Well, what is that 200 reps? Well, it's broken up into these intensity ranges. Okay, that's cool. Now I have a little more clear picture of what that is. Okay, but that still is kind of what does doing 37 reps at 80% mean? Okay, well, then we have to break that down even further into the number of reps in each set. But that again becomes another problem. So understand that high level here, training variables are just the way we prescribe training. The way that you understand what those variables are doing is by creating a system by which you can measure and apply it in a way that you can, say uniformly across 5 athletes. I know what the training volume is. I can compare it from Josh to me to, to whoever else. And I could say, okay, 200 reps at this average intensity at this distribution and blah, blah, blah. Like, my way of doing that is going to give me a clear picture as to what's the difference in my training program for Josh versus for, some other athlete. And so understand that like that system is something that we're going to be discussing and developing and kind of informing you guys of what we think is what we think is currently best practices. It doesn't mean it doesn't change. I would say that like something Josh kind of alluded to earlier is that like in powerlifting now, a lot of people, and especially in hypertrophy training, a lot of people kind of shifted more towards this number of hard sets as a metric for tracking volume, right? And I think you probably Greg Knuckles was one of the first people to discuss this idea of like hard sets as a way of kind of calculating training volume, because ultimately that's the most granular level of training volume that really is meaningful for us to track. Does he need to track the total number of individual contractions, individual reps to get a granular like viewpoint of the hypertrophy training and the effectiveness? No. So hard sets works for that. In weightlifting, we know that metric is different because a hard set could be a single, a double, a triple, could be a complex, could be any number of things. It's not granular enough for us to really draw good conclusions from it. So I say this kind of overview here is that the system is going to adapt. The training variables are the training variables, right? It's what's written down. Our system of sort of making this a palatable thing to understand is going to be different sport to sport. It's going to be different, system to system. That can be individualized. It doesn't have to be that it's uniform across everybody's coaching style. I think that there's probably a benefit to people being more uniform and being able to look at it and say, hey, this is a good way to track this. But ultimately, you can be successful with that. It's just that you have to understand what the variables are and then how you're actually, breaking them into a way that you can digest what you're looking at. Right.
Yeah. And I would say that the idea with all of this is to give coaches the ability to create a system. We're not giving, we don't want to give anybody a system. Don't do things the way I do things. I have a lot of weird quirks. I have a lot of weird preferences. I have a lot of weird tendencies. I'm a strange guy. I mean, look at me. I'm wearing an Onyx crew neck.
This, by the way, anyone who's probably let's address the elephant in the room right now. We didn't call each other and say, hey, let's wear Onyx sweatshirts today. We just so happened to both have impeccable style. And we ended up in the same outfit. So.
Yeah. So yeah, the point is like, we don't want to give you a system. We don't want to give you a periodization. We don't want to give you a program or a template. We want to give you the ability to create what is best for your situation. So just like you would with an athlete, give an individualized program, you would give yourself an individualized coaching process. That's what you need. To kind of continue this discussion of training variables, we have exercise selection. So the application of intensities or loads and volumes, that's going to manifest through the selection and ordering of exercises. This variable is related to all adaptations as it dictates the expression of the training principle. So remember that. We talk about like overload. It's like, what does that mean? We talk about specificity, variation, fatigue management. All of this is expressed through the selection of the mode of training or the exercise that are going to be picked, right? So if you say, well, I can check the bucket of, overload and I can check the bucket of variation, all these things, but you don't have specificity, which is emergent through exercises, your training is going to be terrible, right? You're not going to have the ability to peak performance in a one-arm snatch or clean and jerk. So this variable specifically can make or break a training plan. And it can be used strategically to emphasize different adaptations at different periods of time. So having more eccentric focused work, having more longer range of motion focused work, maybe partial focused work. Again, these are differences in exercise selection. This can drive a different training response. The last training variable I'll mention, and then we'll have an honorable mentions category, is going to be frequency. Could be kind of parentheses duration, which would be the exposures to a given stimulus. This can be broad or specific. So broadly, we can think of this like the back squat. You have frequency for a back squat versus frequency for quad training versus frequency for lower body training. So those are three different things that target roughly the same muscle groups, but can be expressed differently as a frequency, right? So lower body training 3 times a week, completely different from back squat training 3 times a week, or quad training 3 times a week. So we can think of frequency broadly and then very specifically. Kind of in that same vein, we can think of it as we're doing threes across a training block, right? This idea of block periodization. So that's like the frequency of the same repetition range or repetition value across time, versus we want to get higher exposures or higher intensities during a peaking block. So we have more frequent peak intensity exposures. So this idea of frequency can be a little vague and broken down differently based on how you're using it. But basically it's talking about the number of exposures to a given stimulus or stress.
Yeah, I think sorry, I was going to just jump on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so something to think about here with frequency, and I think this word that Josh keeps saying, which is exposure, which is really a very important word for us to consider, is, training variables are simply the application. It's the expression of a particular intent, right? So it's saying, put this much weight on the bar, that's load, do it this many times, without, unbroken, without stopping, right? And then let's do that sort of set of things a bunch of times in a single workout. Right. And then that would be considered the exposure, right? How much are we exposing the organism, the human, the athlete, to a particular stress, right? 80% for 5 reps in the squat, 5 times on that day. That's our stress. That's our exposure. Frequency is something that we look at, and Josh made a great point there in that, you can have 3 layers to this. You can have frequency of a skill application, so frequency of the squat. You can have frequency of the, hypertrophic training of the quadriceps. And then you can have frequency of, potentially like lower body or, the exposure to different joints or whatever, or different types of training, right? So the idea here is that frequency is something that that we can use to modulate the exposure to a particular stress. The manipulation of all these variables, every variable here is interconnected, right? There's relationships between them. Volume and intensity they can both increase the same. They could both decrease. They could go in opposite. They could be inversely related in a program. But there's a connection there, right? You can't just do 10 reps with your 1 rep max, right? And then additionally to that, there are other adjustments too that we have to factor in when we're considering all these variables, right? The increase in intensity of the overall program is going to have some kind of effect on the frequency of the program or the total volume of the program, right? The frequency of the program increases, then the magnitude of each session will have to adjust to accommodate that. So it's not so much that a variable that there's a best or worst, right? This is kind of the big thing, is there's only trade-offs, right? It's if I have a higher frequency, that may have benefits in certain things like skill acquisition. If I snatch every day, I'm going to get a little better at the skill of snatching, right? But the trade-off for that is that those sessions can't be as large a magnitude of volume because I wouldn't be able to recover, right? Or because there's more of them and more volume, the intensity has to be reduced. So we all know this sort of intuitively. We know that you can't do 5x5 every single day of the week. Or maybe we've all learned that, or some coaches learned that at some point in their career, and simply just piling more of one variable onto the process is a short-term strategy at absolute best, right? If we just keep ratcheting up training volume or ratcheting up training intensity, there's a logical end to that, which is that it's going to suppress the ability to manipulate the other variables to actually have a program that is something where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Just dumping intensity onto somebody or dumping volume onto them has a very sort of short-lived kind of, you know, a high that quickly expires, because at some point there's just nowhere to go from there. You can't just keep adding more volume or intensity. So you have to manipulate the other variables. But understanding the interplay between these is probably, in my opinion, more important than really being particularly excellent with any one of these things, right? Writing super high volume programs, not as good a skill, or understanding, you know, not as useful as understanding the interplay between these variables, and then designing programs around optimizing towards a particular outcome by manipulating the training variables.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to discuss those. And then off the back end, we'll just have some honorable mentions. I think we have about 6 minutes left. And obviously you can tell by the discussion that these are going to span, you know, every week. They're going to be comprehensive and kind of build and be really focused on improving coaching, right? So the honorable mentions would be rest periods. Generally, shorter rest periods have more of a metabolic effect and enhanced metabolic adaptations, because you're working on buffering fatigue, buffering the buildup of byproducts that limit your ability to maximally contract a muscle or to contract it maximally over time. So longer rest periods, or the strategic use of them, can enhance bigger and better adaptations. So strength, power, hypertrophy, kind of with frequency. If you break volume up, you can see similar effects across time with respect to hypertrophy, but maybe you get better quality of work, more repeatable work, and then maybe you get like higher outputs in terms of force and rates of force, so that you get a better strength effect, right? So again, there's this like augmentation of training variables with other training variables. We have movement velocities, which is really important, because when we're talking about strength and power, intent, the ability to move something with the most maximal intent concentrically, very critical. So this would be largely responsible for strength and power adaptations, but also could be a place for skill acquisition and more hypertrophy training, where you're attempting to put the most focused tension on a muscle across time. And then lastly, we have muscle actions, which would augment the adaptations, hypertrophy skill, but kind of has less of an effect. So when we think about adding in some sort of eccentric training or more focused eccentric work, having just solely concentric work to maybe focus on power or maximal force, but limit fatigue, we can kind of augment these three things: rest periods, movement velocities, and muscle actions, to help emphasize the aspects of what the other training variables contribute.
Yeah.
So Max, I think we kind of rounded that out.
Yeah.
Do you want to open this up and answer some of the questions?
Yeah, let's open it up to some Q&A stuff. I think it'd be super useful for you guys to ask questions. A bunch of questions in the chat we're going to go through. Yeah, and then, you know, just so you guys are aware, we're going to stay on this a bit and answer these questions. But I believe this is recorded and it'll be available on our YouTube as well, so you guys can check it out.
Well, there's a link in the comments too that will lead them to the mentorship group, so they don't only just see this one, but they can attend next week with Chris Tabor. They can attend the following weeks, and then they can be in this on a recurring basis. So I would definitely hit that link, sign up, and then keep up to date with all these conversations, because again, these are just going to evolve over time. We'll create a repository of all this content, so you can always access it, always access the Q&A. You can always access the experts, and then you'll get eventually access to courses, articles, and other content that can continue to come out. So think of this as a long-term investment. This is kind of like the short-term payoff, and then be a part of it, and then you get access to the rest of it.
Yeah. I'll say, let's start from the top. The first one from Nicholas Cook. Do you all tend to measure volume by tonnage or just reps? So I'll answer my methodology here, but as far as weightlifting goes, I would use a couple of metrics, and part of this is like the degree to which a tool can help with this. So if I was going to write a program and I had very basic tools, I would use repetitions. I would just calculate repetitions, and I would say we're gonna basically look at, you know, breaking those repetitions into different zones of intensity that I want somebody to be maybe focused on. So where are we, where are we giving the most exposure to as far as intensity goes to get the adaptations we want? If somebody is slow, we might shift our volume more towards those lower intensity ranges to build more speed. If somebody's technique is good or bad, we might shift the amount of reps per set up or down to kind of accommodate for that. But basically we would use reps because tonnage is, in my opinion, tonnage is probably the least valuable thing people have ever calculated as far as training goes. I just don't know anyone or have seen anyone apply tonnage in a useful metric. It's just so obscure because you could do, you know, this is like the classic West Side thing would be, Louis would write an article, be like, oh, we do 150,000 pounds of of training volume. And it's like, well, yeah, that's all like curls and presses, and like none of that is meaningfully impactful on the actual squat, bench, or deadlift, right? But the number sounds impressive. Whereas if someone said, hey, we do 600 reps of squat in a month and the distribution of intensities is, you know, is normal and the average intensity is somewhere around 75%, I would say, oh, that's a lot. I understand what that is. It's more clearly defined. So repetitions is great. That's what I would use. The downside to that, the trade-off, is that without better tools to track things in a better way, you miss out on potentially the internal metrics of stress, right? We miss out on how hard was that training load that we gave somebody. We can give them the mechanical and objective, here's reps, sets, intensity, but that might have been very easy, right? That might have fallen short of what they're capable of. And so the actual stress they felt internally was low, and so that they can tolerate more than that. So we don't have that ability without more capable tools, more capable mechanisms. As a plug, that's what we're trying to build here. Is we're trying to build a platform that allows coaches to track as much variables as possible to build out more comprehensive models that are going to be more accurate. So you can say, let's try to calculate the magnitude of difficulty of something relative to another thing, right? So yeah, that's what I would say is reps by far is a much more granular picture for weightlifting. I would almost never, I've never used tonnage as any kind of metric to track volume.
Yeah, I think that's a spot on answer. I don't have a ton to add. I would say tonnage is very imprecise. It's very crude. I will look at it and just say like, okay, we're going to unload this week and we unload like a third of the total work. That's pretty substantial. Like we should feel better. We unload half the work. Like we should feel better. But that's such a crude way to go about it that I only look at it for like big picture stuff of like fatigue management, in the sense of when we unload, we should really unload and not just play around with like, well, if we do this many reps, but they're all on small exercises, what kind of an impact will that have? And again, I think this is where you come into like, let's triangulate as much as we can and create the clearest picture, which is taking multiple variables and comparing them across time. So let's kick to the next question, because I think Max just absolutely slayed that one. This is from Mass or Moran Academy for Strength and Speed. Shout out to them. How would you advise younger coaches on how to develop their system? What steps should they take? This is going to be like this might feel a little trite, but I would say they should join the mentorship group, because what we give them access to basically is like all of the tools from the broadest lens to the most specific lens. And we say, hey, this is what you'll need. Here are people that have applied it. This is what it looks like. And then create a process that you can refine over time, asking questions, getting feedback, and integrating new information. That's basically what we've both done. And I remember it's like the conversations I had with you, the conversations I had with Spencer Arnold, conversations I've had with plenty of great coaches and researchers eventually helped me craft the way I do things. It wasn't born out of any one thing, right? It wasn't born out of any like, if you have this template, you'll have this system. It's more so like, I kind of think I know what matters. How do I like individualize that to me? And I think what the coaching platform is going to do is it's just going to set a really common ground for how you can start. and then change it to evolve over time to what you need. And that's really what people need, is like, we need the biggest tool set possible so that we can pick the tools that make the most sense to us and then apply those repeatedly and consistently. Because here's a great example, and I heard this was in my class recently, Intro to Sports Science and Technology. You look at houses that were built in the 1800s, and then you look at houses that are built currently, probably better tools now, but the quality of the houses are kind of shoddy. Back in like the 1800s, early 1900s, the quality of the houses top notch, right? Because they're still, a lot of them are still standing. They're really well done. The tools have changed, but like the application of those tools might not be in exact alignment with the better technology or newer technology, right? So just because you have different tools, new tools, it doesn't make them better. It's the application of them. But if you have access to them, eventually you can do something really special with your system.
I would say, to add one caveat to that, or this whole thing, one thing is, I would think about what you should avoid doing as a new coach. And the thing I would avoid would be, don't just copy and paste someone else's process and system, because a lot of that can lead you down a road where you go for a long time and think like, oh, well, this guy is doing great, I'm going to just copy his thing and I'm going to use that, because you'll end up being in a place where you kind of stifle your own development when you like just latch on to someone else's system and say, that's what we use. The thing I would do is say, try to gain an understanding of how to read training and how to read the training process. So understand the principles of training first, and then start to look at different coaches' systems and programs and try to grasp what about these programs is making them effective, right? What about this system makes this coach an effective coach? And then start there rather than just replication, right? Look at an actual fundamental understanding.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, the next question is from Method Barbell, and then I'll read this one, Max, and you can tackle it. How do you differentiate the fatigue or volume load, volume/load, value or stress when programming that different set sizes have, i.e., 4 sets of 4 versus 8 doubles versus 16 singles?
So this is the problem that is, for me, the thing we've tried to solve. I think a lot of people have been trying to solve this problem, which is to say, like, what everyone's trying to get to from a holy grail perspective is, how do we equate training stress from non-similar things? So how do we equate the stress of doing a bicep curl to the stress of doing a back squat, right? And like, largely they don't overlap at all, right? So it's like, that may not be the best comparison, but we can't, it's very difficult to do that, right? If we get a little more granular, like snatches to snatches, we can start to compare those movements together. But where it falls apart for a lot of things is, how do you compare the stress of, doing your snatches to squats to deadlifts, right? And so this is a very complex problem. And what we really need to do is be able to, one, understand training volume, training load, then two, understand the internal stresses, basically, accumulated from performing that training load. So if you look at an equation, the equation would be on the left side, and we'd have all of the objective, measurable, basically quantifiable things like the mass of the barbell, the range of motion of the bar, a bar's travel, the number of motor units used in the movement, the tempo of execution. So things we can distinctly measure, and that's on the left side of the equation. The right side of the equation would then be like the internal measure of stress or difficulty of the exercise itself. And so when you do this, you could then sum up, the outcome of this as a metric, which would essentially just be like some arbitrary unit of how stressful is this set. So if you change any of those variables, like the number of reps in a set, that's going to bring you closer to to failure. The internal stress of that set is higher, right? So a set of 10 at, your 10 rep max is more stressful than 10 singles at your 10 rep max, right? And a compounding nonlinear growth of difficulty occurs at the repetition level. So, doing 1 rep at your 10 rep max, you could probably do that 100 times in a row before you accumulate enough stress to where your proximity to failure increases. But if you do them all in one set with no rest time, that escalates non-linearly, so exponential. So what we do is you would look at, okay, how much load intensity, all of these things, the actual measurable things. Then we would say we need a proxy to stand in for how stressful, how difficult, how much exertion is there in this single repetition or single set, and then compound those on top of each other to gain an idea of what is the absolute magnitude of stressfulness of this single set of exercise. Then you have to have a movement coefficient that essentially allows you to compare different movements to each other. So your arbitrary units of stress has to now be normalized across different movements so you can actually compare them to each other. Because if it's not, it's just saying snatches, this way are stressful, squats this way are stressful, but those numbers don't necessarily equal each other. And then once you start to understand this, you can create a normalized variable, a normalized sort of objective measure of stress or difficulty. And then you can start to, make those comparisons. So you could look at, 4x4 or 8x2 and objectively say, look, 4x4 at the same weight as 8x2 is going to be more stressful because the internal stress of a set of 4 at the same weight has to be higher. One more caveat to this that I'll say is that the proximity to failure, again, has a nonlinear relationship to how hard the set's going to be. So, if you do 8x2, and let's say RPE is your measure of how stressful it is, 8x2 at an RPE of 4, it's probably never going to get harder, right? The number of sets at RPE 4 you'd have to do before you start to accumulate enough, stress to actually have that RPE significantly climb up would be enormous, right? You have to maybe do 20 sets, right, to finally get that thing to feel harder. But if the initial set is a RPE 9, the next set is going to have a significantly larger stress. It's the perceived RPE of the next set would be higher already, right? So understand that those relationships are largely proximity to failure, right? Basically as an internal metric. I say all this because I have actually been spending an enormous amount of time building this kind of calculation for our AI product, right? So we have to be able to calculate a shitload of variables and a lot of stuff and have a mechanism that we can gather an internal metric of stress, of difficulty, to be able to make this work. If you don't know the internal stress, you don't know how hard something is, right? So you're just equating volume to itself, which is, ultimately going to be a problem. The 8x2 and 4x4 are essentially the same level of difficulty.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, or the ironic thing is that in March, our expert speaker is going to be Jake Rimmer, who is an expert on proximity to failure.
Right.
That's what he's researched. So I think that's really cool to be able to tie that in. I don't want to say anything because I think this would really drag because I have a lot of thoughts. So maybe we'll just kick to the next question because that was a very comprehensive take. This is by Anders Borson, which is, how do you evaluate if your athletes are making progress without using max outs too often? And I'll say, before I let you jump in, there's some concept of invisible monitoring, which is kind of void of monitoring strategies like jump testing or different types of testing or subjective testing. You just watch someone train. You watch someone perform. And while crude and while you would have to be present, this is like a form of saying, how ready are they on the day to accomplish the task of the training session? Because ultimately the training session is designed in a way to create an adaptation, short, medium, and long term, either having some sort of performance effect or potentiating effect for the next session. So I would say this invisible monitoring of just being a good coach is like one aspect. Other aspects are building in ways of testing or evaluating that are specific to the adaptation. So if we're thinking about muscle size, you'll often hear of proxies like the ability to perform a certain amount of work at a certain load, or the amount of the ability to do higher repetition RMs and improve that. If we're thinking about strength, you might talk about lower repetition, higher intensity testing procedures. But generally, you know, it's something like strength or performance or skill acquisition. Those are very obvious. You know if you're making progress or not. Something like hypertrophy is going to be a bit more complicated. You would look at body weight across time. And then you'd have to kind of figure in like, okay, are we doing the correct amount of training, or are they intentionally trying to gain weight? Are they gaining weight? And then you're taking some proxy measures and kind of triangulating them. How do you know if you're making progress? Honestly, I know because week to week, people look better, or they should be consistently looking better or performing well. They should be able to perform whatever's prescribed, or if it's some sort of like auto-regulated approach, they should be hitting, you know, heavier weights. The weights should look better. There are these like directions or signposts that are kind of obvious and helpful. And that's all predicated on the construction of the training program.
Yeah, I would say the only thing that is like monitoring, right? It's a lot about monitoring the subtlety, right? Is, you know, are reps getting easier at the same weight? Is the bar moving better? Is technique improving? Like, it's the subtlety of that, you know, versus having like a definitive, like, do this, you know, and you do that 5 times, it equals this max, right?
Yeah, awesome. The last question, I mean, we've had a lot of great comments. Jim said, "You're making my sports science brain go into overdrive. Welcome to our lives." And then Jordan from Method Barbell said, "For sure, called each other to match." We actually did do that. So let's get to the last question, which is, can you guys talk about considerations for a selection of accessories as well as their volume for different phases of training? Max, you want to tackle this one?
Yeah. So talk about considerations for selection of accessories as well as their volume. Yeah. So again, accessories, I think the way that we define it would be like single joint movements in something like powerlifting or weightlifting, right? Basically something that is general in nature. The real sole purpose of this, I would say maybe a couple purposes. One, any kind of rehabilitation stuff, any kind of like something that needs to be done to, you know, ensure proper functioning of the body, right? Your shoulder hurts, you have to do a certain exercise to keep it from hurting. But the main real reason here is to just drive more tension through the muscle and build some hypertrophy, potentially some strength as well. So with that in mind, it's going to be based on how much, you know, muscle hypertrophy you need in a particular area, how much strength you need based on where you're weak, right? If you have, if you have super weak shoulders and you need more volume there, allocate more volume there. Understand that you should probably pull some of volume from somewhere else. It's not needed. You know, the amount of accessory work you do in a program, if you look at the goal of the program, that would be the most defining element. So if your goal is high performance in Olympic weightlifting, then the amount of accessory work you do should be basically the minimum needed to achieve proper function in your body and drive enough hypertrophy and strength in particular muscle groups that you don't suffer performance losses because of it, right? I know that sounds like such a stupid answer because it's just like, well, yeah, obviously. But yeah, it's like, you know, there's no need to do more than is necessary, right? If your goal is something else, like to be jacked and look fucking awesome, then that's got to be reflective of that. Maybe you do way more shrugs and curls and tricep push downs or something, you know. So the allocation of it is purely a result of what is needed. If it's performance in barbell exercises, it's only going to be what supports the progress there.
Yeah, and I'll say, I think that was a great take on the question. The only thing I'll say is, like, what's funny is a lot of these questions seem to be answered by simple answers, which is, you know, how do you know if someone's performing well or progressing? It's like, oh, here's a very simple answer. The complexity really lies in the programming component. And it's not just programming. It's not just writing a program or a week of programming or a month. It's doing that consistently and at a high level over time. And that's kind of what we're attempting to tackle, is like this question of performance in a single session and across sessions with, which can often look like simple answers, but the way to get to that simple answer is often through a lot of work.
Yep.
Cool. How do you feel about this one, Max? You ready to wrap up?
Yeah, that's great. Let's wrap it up. I think yeah, we'll kind of get a little plug here, but basically this is the first Free Friday, so we're kind of testing out our process. We'll see how it goes. Maybe we are long-winded. You guys leave feedback. Anyone that was here, please leave feedback. Tell us how much you didn't like the way Josh spoke to you, the way he looks, anything like that, and I'll take that into consideration. No. Super fun. This is good. We want to get more feedback and iterate on this process. If you guys are interested, which, hopefully we get a bunch of people in here, but the mentorship program is $48 a month. It's a steal for how much content is going to be put into this. And the fact that it's a completely ongoing process. So yeah, go ahead, sign up. I would highly recommend it. We're going to just continue to grow this and build out a massive wealth of information and education. So yeah, the link is in the chat. Obviously, that'll be sent out in emails as well. So anyone that was here will get that. This will be posted on YouTube, on the Coachlogik YouTube, and you'll be able to watch it again and gather any information from there you want.
Yeah, awesome. I think that's it for us. We really appreciate everyone who contributed, was a part of it, and came to be a part of the first Free Friday, which is something that we'll hope to continue and do better and better each time, as Max said.
Awesome. Take care, guys.